Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Our topic today is pivoting to ADA compliant virtual meetings. My name is Steve Metzer and I'm an ADA compliant specialist for DLZ. I've been performing ADA compliant services for clients for over 10 years in a number of different states. We're glad you've taken the time to attend this webinar, and we think you will find it very informational if you use virtual meetings in any of the ways that we will discuss. We're using the webinar option in Zoom. We're also streaming this live on DLZ's corporate Facebook page. And we're recording it so we can make it available with the transcript at the end. Note that I will not be using the chat or raise hand features that are available. However, if you do have a technical issue, DLZ's IT staff will be monitoring the chat window. Please identify your issue there, and they will attempt to assist you. We will not be allowing verbal interactions today, so we will remain muted for the webinar other than myself. We do encourage anyone with a question to please use the Q&A feature to submit those at any time. We have some questions that were submitted in advance that we will also be answering. We are providing closed captioning of today's webinar. You should see a note on your screen that closed caption is available. You can enable that feature by clicking on the CC icon and select hide or show at any time to change your CC option. I will now turn off my camera so as to not distract you during my presentation. I will turn it back on during the Q&A at the end. I hope to accomplish a number of objectives today. First, I'll discuss why this topic is particularly relevant now, and especially who is using virtual meeting technology. Note that throughout my presentation today, I'll regularly refer to a generic term of meetings. This includes all different types of virtual meetings, webinars like we're doing now, public meetings, trainings, online instruction, and similar type of activities. Second, I'll briefly discuss the three most relevant laws that apply and when they apply for virtual meetings and presentations. Next, I'll review the potential barriers to access for persons with disabilities to your meetings. And I will also discuss options available for you to maximize accessibility. Last, I will provide some websites that are excellent resources for more information on accessibility topics. We do have limited time, so the overall level of detail today will be fairly low. I cannot go into detail about each different meeting platform. Contact your service provider for assistance and options for accessibility for assistance with your platform. Note also that accessibility statutes are complex laws, and today's webinar presents only the most relevant parts of all of those. The information presented today should not be considered to be legal advice in any way. So, why is the topic of virtual meetings so relevant now? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that primarily it is due to the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID has resulted in the exclusion or limiting public access to many facilities due to social distancing and other requirements. Nearly 1 in 5 persons in the US have one or more disabilities. And many of these disabilities make attending meetings or virtual meetings difficult or even impossible. However, none of the laws we will discuss can be ignored due to the pandemic. Virtual meetings and instruction must still comply with all the laws that apply to you. To continue government operations, most local and state governments have resorted to online public meetings. Accessibility of some of these meetings is mixed at best. This is most often due to just a basic lack of knowledge about what is required and how to provide it. That is a primary reason for this webinar. We wanted to inform you about the requirements and how to ensure access through and after the pandemic. In addition, nearly all elementary and secondary schools and colleges and universities closed and pivoted to online instruction in the spring. Some will continue to provide online instruction, at least to some extent, in the fall. On the business side of things, many meetings and trainings are now being done online. This is much more common in the past also, and is likely to continue. Many virtual meeting platforms have emerged during this pandemic. In addition to Zoom, which I'm using today, and there are many others. Some of the most common include Microsoft Teams, GoToMeeting, WebEx, BlueJeans, Skype, and many, many others. All have similarities and differences, with most providing at least some accessibility features. The most common universal feature is open or closed captioning. Closed captions, such as what is being provided today in this webinar, allows you, the user, to turn the captions on or off. Closed caption is also available on many videos and televisions for the hearing impaired. Open captions or subtitles are always on. You have no ability to turn them off. Some virtual meeting platforms have other accessibility features. These could include special keyboard accessibility, generation of automatic transcripts, support for screen reading programs that blind persons use, magnifiers to enlarge information on a computer screen, and even recording of meetings and presentations. Virtual meetings are great tools, and they have great utility. They allow for much more productive interaction than just a simple conference call. During the pandemic, DLZ and many other businesses have used them extensively. Project meetings, staff meetings, and other types of meetings that would normally be held in person or be a simple conference call are now being done via video. Outside of business uses, many people have used them to keep in contact with friends and family during the quarantine. I've used them to do story time with my grandkids and play weekly virtual Yahtzee with friends. And I even had to meet our newest grandchild over Zoom due to visitor restrictions at the hospital. Having a virtual meeting platform available to you opens up a whole new world of remote contact. Ensuring that your information is accessible to persons with disabilities allows them to access it from their homes. While they are great tools, virtual meetings are not the same as being in person. These virtual meetings do have some limitations that cannot be overcome. One challenge is turn-taking for meetings, where you have multiple presenters or meetings of public officials who all want to comment on issues, and that can be very awkward. I'm sure most of you have been on a call or online meeting when multiple people speak at the same time. Then everyone stops talking and there's silence, with people saying, "Go ahead, go ahead." This interaction makes it difficult to know who is speaking and to hear the entire dialogue. That is true especially for someone typing in captions. Depending on your type of virtual meeting, you may have different technology than the audience. For example, today I'm using 2 monitors at my workstation during this webinar. This allows me the ability to see what is being displayed to you, the audience, as well as questions as they come in and the number of participants. Attendees might be limited in a number of ways technologically. It could be on the size and number of displays, which would impact their ability to fully comprehend what is presented. If you have watched any meetings on a smartphone, I'm sure you have wished for a screen at least the size of a tablet. In some cases, where video is presented, bandwidth of attendees may be a limiting factor as well. Last, any technical issues that you may have or attendees may have cannot be resolved or worked through in many virtual meetings. A small company business meeting or similar type of meeting where you know all the attendees may allow you to assist with those technical issues, but that's something that you would have to address individually. Let's now discuss very briefly some of the legal requirements. There are 3 statutes that apply for access to virtual meetings for the disabled. All have similar requirements of mandating accessibility, but they do differ on who is regulated. I will briefly present information about each one of these individually. First, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, applies to all public and private entities. This includes all local units of government, which is anything state government or smaller. Other public entities that might be covered include schools, park commissions, library boards, transit authorities, and any other self-governing body. ADA also covers many or most private entities, things like hotels, motels, social service centers, medical care facilities, retailers, and others. The ADA does not require that a covered entity receive federal funds to be regulated. ADA requires that entities provide access to disabled persons to the services and programs that are provided, which obviously differ. This includes physical access to your facilities and the programs and services provided at those facilities. Think of programs as the various functions of an entity. For governments, examples include payment of taxes and other fees, voting, recreation programs, public safety, police, fire, courts, and access to meetings. Often, additional regulations exist about what meetings must be open. These Open Meetings Act laws are not going to be discussed today, but could extend to virtual meetings also. For private entities, programs primarily include access to the goods and services that they provide at their physical buildings. The Rehabilitation Act, particularly Part 504, prohibits discrimination based on a person's disability. Any program or activity that receives federal funding is covered under Part 504. That is regardless of whether they are a public or a private entity. The Rehabilitation Act is very broad. It covers everything that receives federal funds. Airports, universities, all federal agencies are some good examples of who is covered under the Rehabilitation Act Part 504. Section 504 also requires public schools provide a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, for disabled students, similar to the next statute we will review. Since state-sponsored universities receive federal funds and are also considered a public entity, they must comply both with Section 504 and the ADA, and there's a lot of overlap between all 3 of these. Next, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, applies to state and local schools. This law was known previously as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act until 1990. IDEA covers all children who are deemed eligible within a specific disability category. These children need special education and related services covered under IDEA. IDEA also requires a free appropriate public education, or FAPE, like the Rehabilitation Act does. However, IDEA goes further and requires the development of an individualized education program, or IEP, document. An IEP is prepared for each eligible student, and it includes specific content and identifies the required participants at an IEP meeting to discuss that program. IDEA also requires written notice to parents regarding identification, evaluation, and/or placement in special education for their child. Further, written notice must be made prior to any change in placement of a student under IDEA. So, what does all this mean? Well, I assume a majority of those of you attending today's webinar have been providing in-person meetings of some kind in the past prior to COVID. If so, you have always had an obligation for accessible meetings. You have also been required to provide reasonable accommodation for those meetings. In-person meetings have very specific requirements for facility access. An example would be ramps instead of stairs to enter buildings where public meetings are held to allow individuals with wheelchairs to access. There are also requirements for equally effective communication. Accommodation of people with disabilities that identify in advance of a public meeting that they need it is vital. Virtual meetings have no real facility that can present a barrier to accessing information. The focus of virtual meetings needs to be on accommodations for that equally effective communication. At DLZ, we've consistently communicated to our clients the need to advertise this opportunity. Details about how to request accommodations on meeting notices and meeting agendas are extremely important. This allows disabled persons or their caregivers the ability to know who to contact in advance if they need a meeting accommodation. This information is even more critical for virtual meetings. People who have communication disabilities use different ways to obtain information, and each person has different needs to be provided equally effective communication. Ensuring that a disabled person can communicate, receive information, and convey information for meetings is vital. In-person meetings have several requirements for accessibility. Things like wheelchair access and clear spaces for wheelchairs are required within the room. Assistive listening systems and devices must be made available, and signage needs to be provided to notify attendees that these devices are available. Both of these requirements are based on seating capacity, and attendees do not need to provide advance notice or request these in advance as an accommodation. These required items are often not provided in public meeting facilities, particularly the listening system and devices. As mentioned on the previous slide, in-person meetings require reasonable accommodations upon request, and I'm stressing upon request. These should be provided per your policy, assuming you have one as required. Whether you require 24 or 48 hours or 3 business days notice, requests for accommodation need to be acknowledged and honored in some way. A common request is for an American Sign Language interpreter. Other requests could include alternate formats for information presented in your council packet, for example, if you make that available. Accommodations could include providing large print documents or Braille documents or audio recordings of meetings after they are completed. Let's now cover some of the most common potential barriers to the disabled to your virtual presence and ways that you can try to avoid them. Note that the information that follows could easily be supplemented by a presentation equally as long as this webinar for each of these barrier types. There's a quote that says, "For most people, technology makes things easier, but for people with disabilities, technology makes things possible." That is, assuming you consider their needs and integrate them into your meetings. An auditory barrier would be presented to persons who are deaf or hard of hearing. They are not able, oftentimes, to understand verbal information or hear sound alerts if you use those in a meeting. Persons that are blind, have low vision, or are colorblind may not be able to clearly see any or all the items provided on a presentation or a virtual meeting if it's not formatted properly. Persons with limited fine or gross motor skills may have difficulty typing. They may not be able to use a chat or a questions area to submit questions during a presentation. And some persons may have difficulty processing information delivered orally, visually, or both. This is especially true if the information presented is not clear. Let's discuss how to try and avoid each of these potential barriers. If you didn't already know before today, your virtual events need to be accessible to the disability community. Accessibility really cannot be an afterthought. It needs to be part of your initial planning. As mentioned earlier, most meeting platforms are compatible with assistive technology like screen readers for written materials. It is important to verify, however, that is the case with the program you use. Also, ensure the platform you're using allows for computer-based audio listening and speaking, and phone-based audio listening and speaking. This allows the disabled, particularly, to use third-party services if they are deaf or hard of hearing. It also allows them to use any special devices or applications on phones, tablets, and computers. Make sure your events offer multiple ways for attendees to participate, answer questions, submit questions, and interact if that applies to your meeting. As mentioned, for today's webinar, we are not allowing direct verbal interaction. We did request questions be submitted in advance as well as during the presentation. So please feel free to submit questions as we move along, and we will respond to those when we're completed. You know your audience better than anyone else. This includes the ability of your audience to figure out how to navigate and attend these virtual meetings. You might want to consider offering training sessions prior to your event. That training could include information on how to use the platform your events will be hosted on, which could be particularly important for meetings and issues that have social justice implications. It would also apply especially to areas that have high environmental justice populations. This would include meetings with topics that could disproportionately impact people who are low income or minorities, and those who have limited ability to understand spoken and written English. Instruction may be available on YouTube or other places on the internet for your platform. Consider offering accessibility information up front and publicly to interested attendees. If you are captioning or recording a meeting, state that on the meeting notice. Provide all your written and visual materials in advance upon request to give those people that need it an idea of what to expect and the ability to plan in advance. This may not always apply, but consider where it may do that. Be sure to use accessible file formats for documents and other files. Accessibility of those file formats and meetings can often be verified by local disability advocacy groups. Most communities have a Center for Independent Living and other advocacy group in the area. And all states have a regional ADA center that can also assist if you reach out to them. As mentioned previously, allow attendees for virtual training and webinars to send questions and comments in advance. The screenshot shown on this slide of questions submitted in advance from a recent presentation by the U.S. Access Board. It was regarding requirements for accessible toilet and bathing facilities. There are both questions and statements provided, allowing presenters to pre-plan responses. This could easily be done for virtual public meetings, especially where the public is not allowed to interact directly with elected officials. Ensuring that meeting agendas and other information is available as soon as possible before the meeting is really important. Advanced submittal of questions and comments can be extremely beneficial to persons that may have difficulty typing a question or comment during a meeting in a timely manner. Now let's talk a little bit more about the design of your virtual meeting presentation to ensure accessibility. Many of these principles apply to multiple situations, not just virtual meetings. Probably most important to persons that have vision loss or low vision is your selection of fonts and how you use it. You need to ensure that fonts are easy to read and that the text is large. You should also ensure that the text has good color contrast with the background. Also, select a font that is clean. Avoid many of the serif fonts, such as Times Roman, unless the font size is fairly large. Serif fonts have a small line or stroke attached to the end of a larger stroke in a letter or symbol, as shown on the right part of the slide with those serif fonts. Serif fonts are a much bigger barrier for tactile signs, those that would be used by blind people to touch and feel what is being said on the sign, than visual signs, but avoid them still if at all possible. The font for the header on this slide is a serif font, but it is large enough that it, at least to most of us, would appear clear and easy to read. Do not use script and other decorative fonts regardless of size. They can be very problematic visually as well as for screen reading programs. You see presented here a number of examples of font types to avoid. Ensure that there is good contrast between your text and the background. As beautiful as this sunset is, this background presents many issues. The color variations make text color contrast difficult with a single color. This photo should be a wallpaper on your computer and not a background for a presentation. Vision issues can also include color blindness. If you have been to an optometrist lately, you probably recognize eye charts. Each has a number embedded in a field of dots used to test color blindness. Persons with color blindness have issues with some or all of these patterns. Reds and blues tend to be the most prevalent colors that can be an issue, so it is best to minimize your reliance on color differentiation in presentations. Instead, rely on that color contrast. For the highest level of accessibility, use high contrasting fonts and backgrounds. Your focus should be on simple colors and using dark on light or light on dark. The figure on this slide shows examples of different colors that have poor to good contrast. Use of colors within the good contrast spectrum for foregrounds and backgrounds is really recommended. To be inclusive of all attendees, use plain language in your presentations. That might not be possible in a technical presentation, but consider your audience and the topic being presented. Minimize the use of jargon or terms that not everyone may know or understand. And do not use flashing or strobing animations in your presentations. These can be very troublesome and in some cases can cause seizures. Ensure that your slides are uncluttered and have an abundance of white space. This can be difficult when you have a lot of information you want to convey, but do what you can. Try to use images to help explain concepts wherever possible, rather than text, as was done in the previous slides with color contrast. If you do use images, include alternative text and image descriptions for people using screen reading programs. If you're going to be uploading a recording or video to YouTube or Facebook, you may have the option to use automated captions. If you elect to do this, make sure you review and edit those captions to fix any errors before publications. As you can see on the screen here, I'm pretty sure Carlos Peña would not like to be called Hitler. Practice your presentation to a select audience to identify any potential visual or content issues prior to going live. Include a review of the visual and sound quality as well as the accuracy of captioning. Some of the best presentations have been ruined by poor visual or audio quality. If you are presenting a recorded video for a training or to be used in an instructional environment, you really should consider hiring a professional to write captions for those videos. An alternative, if you know all attendees, would be to prepare a written transcript of the video. Most videos that are not captioned severely limit usability to persons with hearing loss. If you receive a request for an American Sign Language interpreter, hire one that is qualified. You can find an American Sign Language interpreter using resources like the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf at www.rid.org. Considering hiring a professional or even a third-party service to provide real-time captioning for your live events, especially for webinars and events where speakers will be interacting with attendees and answering questions in real time. Avoid using screen sharing options available with some meeting platforms, including Zoom. They're usually not accessible to screen readers. Use the webinar feature instead, like we are doing today. Obviously, if you are doing an internal company meeting and know all your attendees again, your options change. Just be aware of your audience. In addition to the last couple of items on the previous slide to ensure access to persons that have hearing loss, there are a few others. Make sure your audio is clear. Poor audio quality can make it hard for people to access your event. It can also make it difficult for computer programs or apps that those people that need it use to reduce background noise. Have all your presenters who are speaking use a headset to improve audio quality. Hosts and presenters should be in a quiet room where they won't be disturbed. I'm sure you don't want to hear my dog barking at the Amazon delivery person in the middle of this presentation. Mute all attendees except speakers to keep background noise to a minimum. If you do allow or need interaction, be in control of the mute button to ensure that only one person can speak at a time. If you have more than one presenter, have each person say their name to introduce themselves every time they speak so that you know there's a change in speakers. This allows not only attendees, but also those that are doing captions to know who is talking. So, should you have an ASL interpreter for all your meetings? Well, if requested, you should definitely consider it as an accommodation. But no, not all deaf persons understand and can read American Sign Language. Sign language is not a good substitute for captioning, but it is a good supplement. According to various statistics, only about 10% of deaf persons know American Sign Language. The other 90% rely upon other means, such as captioning or other visual text and lip reading. ASL interpreters have become very visible during the pandemic. As shown on this picture on this slide of a press conference of Michigan's governor, nearly every agency has been including ASL interpreters at updates on the coronavirus pandemic. The interpreter is typically off to the side and behind the speakers to be socially distant, yet remain within the video screen. It is also important to note that interpreters do not wear face masks. This is due to the added benefit of persons reading the signing to be able to see lip and other facial movements and expressions. ASL interpreters also tend to wear clothing that contrasts with their skin color. This is so their hands and fingers are much more visible when doing the signing. If presenters' faces are visible to meeting participants, make sure the speaker's face is well lit and can be clearly seen. This includes lighting in the front. Avoid bright lights or windows in the background. These tend to result in the face of the speaker looking dark. If you're going to use a poll or something similar in your presentation, make sure all participants can access that process. If you're going to indicate who can speak next in a chat or other visual cue, ensure all participants can access that process as well. Describe any live scenarios in a play-by-play type conversation. For example, if you're presenting a live video tutorial of a science experiment for a high school chemistry class, you could describe the process as, I am now mixing the two chemicals together to see how they react. Then describe that reaction. The reaction produced a gas that caused bubbling in the container, which overflowed into the sink. Also, make sure you describe any relevant images, read any relevant text, and describe anything that you gesture at as if you were explaining it to someone who isn't in the same room as you. For example, if someone posts something in a chat room that you present to the entire audience, you should describe that drawing or picture and read the question before you respond. When interacting with persons, it is important to be patient, especially for the intellectual and developmentally disabled, such as elementary or secondary special education students. This is also important when meeting attendees express frustration using an online platform. Don't get caught up as the presenter in issues posted on chat related to irrelevant topics. Repeat information if you find it necessary and are requested to do so. Worth noting again, use accessible, plain, and simple language during your events. Avoid using technical terms and jargon whenever possible. You need to build also processing time and breaks into your event. This is particularly important for training and instruction and online learning for schools. It's difficult for everyone to sit in front of a computer screen for hours at a time with no break so they can stretch and use the restroom. Also, be sure to leave ample time for questions. Consider responding to questions you are not able to answer due to time constraints as a follow-up following your event. Also, ensure that the speaker reads each question and the responses clearly. When your event is over, it's important to share meeting materials in an accessible format upon request. This includes your presentation and any video or audio recording that is made. Post a blog to share questions and responses for anyone that was not able to participate live. You can also answer questions that you didn't have time to get to during a live presentation on a blog. Offer attendees the opportunity to provide feedback about your event, including the accessibility. It will certainly help you prepare for the planning stages of your next event. We should all be striving to be perfect and continue to learn as the technology and the ability to use it and the different uses evolves. Making accessibility a priority and an ongoing inclusive conversation for all your events is really important. Don't be restricted to only making your virtual meetings accessible. The technology that's currently available and that which is likely to follow soon provides opportunities never before imagined. We should all be able to improve access to the disabled to all types of virtual meetings. As we wrap up, I'd like to offer some good internet resources. All provide information about various accessibility topics. The first is the U.S. Department of Justice website at www.ada.gov. This website is probably one of the best one-stop locations for accessibility information. The Department of Justice website includes information about the different accessibility laws and other resources and technical information. There's also a technical assistance resource available via telephone or email. And I do utilize that fairly regularly when I have questions about interpretation of the ADA standards. The second website is the U.S. Access Board at www.access-board.gov. The Access Board was created in 1973 with the adoption of the Rehabilitation Act. It's an independent federal agency that promotes equality for the disabled. The Access Board is comprised of members from most federal departments, as well as a number of members appointed by the President. Many of these public appointees have a disability, as do many of the staff of the board. The Access Board develops the technical standards and guidelines that we all utilize for things like sidewalks and ramps. The board also provides technical assistance and training. Their websites provide these standards and guidelines along with animations for accessibility. A number of advocacy groups also have good information specific to meetings, webinars, and training. The first link shown on this slide is for an 8-page publication on effective communication on the US DOG site. That will take you right there. The second link is for the Big Hack by Scope, whose mission is to make technology accessible. Next is a link to Rooted in Rights, which is part of the advocacy group Disability Rights Washington. Their site includes information on making virtual meetings and events accessible. They also have a review of advantages and disadvantages of the different video conferencing applications and software programs. Next is a link to the ADA National Network training page. The ADA National Network consists of 10 different regional ADA centers and also includes an ADA Knowledge Translation Center. The network offers a wide range of training on all accessibility topics, quite often for free. I regularly watch their monthly webinars or refer to archive webinars all the time. They just recently held a webinar a couple of weeks ago about some of the specific platforms available for virtual meetings. A video of that presentation is available at their website. And last is a link to the New York City Virtual Meeting Accessibility Guide. It was actually prepared earlier in the pandemic and includes some really good basic information about virtual meeting accessibility with a pretty good number of links at the end to various other resources. You could easily do a Google search, and that will give you any number of resources of information on accessibility topics depending on what you search for. For those of you in the education field, I have also provided a few links for that as well. Note that there are very specialized programs for teaching that may be utilized by schools. Some of the more common ones that I found include Schoolology and Google Classroom, along with Zoom and others. If you have a student with special needs or want more information about what your school district is doing to be accessible, I suggest contacting them directly to discuss it. The first link on this page is to the National Association for the Deaf's position statement page. They have a number of position papers, particularly on education for the deaf, that are very good. Next is a link to a private business site that provides more details about the different laws for accessibility that pertain to K through 12 schools. And last is a website for Ohio State University's Digital Accessibility Center. Ohio State is a leader in accessibility, and their website can be a really good resource. That's particularly true for those of you in higher education, but it does apply elsewhere. That concludes our presentation for today. I'm going to turn my camera back on, and I will begin responding to questions that were provided to us in advance of the webinar. So hello, everyone. The first question we got was, how much does it cost for an American Sign Language interpreter? Well, as with most services, costs vary. I've seen estimates range from $50 to up to $150 per hour or more. Often, there's a minimum of 2 hours or some other minimum number of hours, depending again on the individual. Consider, however, there may be an opportunity to use local colleges that have an American Sign Language program. The second question, are we required to do captioning of all meetings? The simple answer is probably not. You are only required to do so if requested in advance. I would add, however, that it is recommended that you do provide captions for all events to maximize accessibility. If you record or rebroadcast meetings, you can still be requested to provide captioning after the event. It is considered best practice to provide captions for both live and recorded meetings. As noted earlier in the presentation, the accuracy of that captioning is also extremely important. Third question, what virtual platforms are considered the best, quote unquote, for virtual meeting accessibility? Well, while it really depends on the user and their abilities, Zoom is typically the one that is preferred based on some of the information that I found. A survey by an accessibility testing firm found somewhere around 92% of disabled persons surveyed prefer to use Zoom. Zoom does have some issues, but overall is rated pretty high. And all the platforms are continuing to make improvements on the fly as new programs continue to emerge. Question number 4, is there software that can provide captions for a live meeting? If not, how should we approach live council meetings? Well, the different platforms available do have different abilities to provide captions for live meetings. There are also some programs available that will provide speech to text like Dragon and others. The accuracy of these programs does vary, but they certainly can be used, and more often than not would probably be better than nothing. But live council meetings and other meetings with a large number of speakers presents a huge challenge. As I mentioned earlier, the awkwardness of turn taking can be a really big problem. More so if the council members are not all at the same location, like many of them have been in the pandemic. If you're captioning the meeting as recommended, it may be possible to program your sound system with the name of each council member so that when you caption, it states who is saying that. That way their name is shown along with what they are saying in captions. Ensuring that not only the words being spoken are displayed, but also identifying who is saying them is really, really important, particularly when you get into political discussions. I'm not sure if there is any one single response to this question that would apply to everyone that's watching today. I suggest you discuss and work with your IT support and determine what will work with your specific sound system for your in-house meetings that are broadcast. There's certainly a solution for everyone, but the costs, accuracy of those captions, and other features are going to be different. Based on many of the things I'm seeing out there, a lot of companies are working to accelerate their speech-to-text options and improve the accuracy of those speech-to-text programs. That's probably the best thing we can all hope for, along with providing written transcripts that can be made from an audio recording and distributed after your meetings. Question 5. Our small city has very limited resources and budget. What can we do for our online meetings within these constraints? Is there funding assistance available anywhere? Well, I know we have attendees today from all sizes of local government, and I've worked with all different sizes of local governments on various ADA compliance issues. I'm not personally aware of any funding assistance to help those of you that fall into that category. I'm sure every one of you would like to get funding assistance. Financial impacts of COVID have been realized across the board for all sizes of government as well as education. Perhaps some assistance may be available through the stimulus bills that may be coming again soon from the federal government if they adopt something, which all accounts are they will. Until that time, you may not be able to provide all the accommodation needed. That puts you at risk certainly for discrimination complaints, unless you can determine ways to provide that equal accommodation or that equally effective communication. I'm not an attorney and would not offer legal advice to any of you, but suggest you contact your regional ADA center or a local advocacy group. They are there to assist, and they may be able to give you a solution that will fit your specific situation. Question 6, what do we need to provide at public information meetings for projects? Well, I'm assuming most of these public input meetings for projects are in person. So you have obligations there that include the physical access for the facility where you hold the meeting, even if you don't own it. This includes ensuring you have accessible parking, sidewalks, ramps, building entrances, and all those types of things that are related. I would suggest you also be sure to include in all your meeting notices information about how someone can request an accommodation. That could include providing information in advance of what you're going to present or hand out and ensuring that it's in an accessible format. That accessible format could be anything from a large print document or maybe even a Braille document in some cases. Meeting presentations, if you use PowerPoint, a lot of times display boards should use many of the principles I discussed earlier. Your use of good fonts and font sizes and color contrast, and trying to minimize your technical jargon and terms where you can. If you use an open house type format for your meetings, ensure you have adequate project representatives available that can assist persons that need it. Walk them around individually if they need assistance. Provide multiple ways for people that are attending your meetings to provide input, including after the event in case someone cannot do so at the meeting on a piece of paper. Your needs are mainly limited to the physical features unless you receive a request for accommodation prior to that meeting. But that really should not restrict you from anticipating potential accessibility needs of attendees and do what you can to provide it. Question 7. I've seen some communities create a position for and hire an ADA coordinator. Do we need to do that also? Well, all Title II entities, which are local units of government, with 50 or more employees are required by ADA to have an ADA coordinator. We tend to suggest to all of our clients, our government clients, that they have an ADA coordinator even if they have less than 50 employees. The only government agencies that I've really seen create a new position for ADA coordinator are typically quite large, usually a large city or a large county, also large colleges and universities. Most others simply just dub the person as a ADA coordinator that's already an existing employee and just add it to your responsibilities. I'm also often quite often asked by clients, who should we name our ADA coordinator? And I tend to tell them there's really no requirement for any specific individual or department to be housing your ADA coordinator. As long as that person that is named can gain the necessary knowledge and learn what is required to be able to fulfill all the requirements of an ADA coordinator, it can really be anyone. The requirements are not really all that significant. Again, depends on your specific situation and size of government, but it would include things like receiving all the complaints if you get any, and ensuring that they're resolved according to your grievance procedure that hopefully you do have. It would also include keeping good records of all your ADA compliance efforts, and ensuring that you're following your ADA transition plan, again, if you have one like you are required to do. On projects that I've worked for on clients, the ADA coordinator has been anything from the city or county engineer quite often, since all the sidewalks and curb ramps are tied directly to state DOT funding. Sometimes it's been the facilities person or maintenance person, since all the buildings have unique access needs as well. It's also fairly common for the human resources or personnel staff or director to be the ADA coordinator, since all the Title I functions are housed in that department. Regardless of who you give that responsibility, the person is not the only one responsible. When we're working with clients, we typically suggest that all large departments have a liaison to the ADA coordinator, and sometimes even recommend that an internal ADA committee be formed. That committee could discuss accessibility issues and needs, and develop project lists and costs for budgeting for submittal to your elected officials, as well as being put on a capital improvement plan. Many communities also choose to form a citizens committee to assist in this task. The city's Citizens Commission is often volunteers, many of whom may be disabled. And they can help you determine the priority improvements and accessibility needs, and investigate any issues that arise. So I guess the short answer is no, you don't need to hire an ADA coordinator, but you do need to have one most times. And if you aren't required to, we recommend that you consider doing it anyways. And also ensure that the name and contact information for that person is prominently displayed on your website and known to all your departments. Question 8, I know many of our constituents do not have computers or internet at home. How can we reach them when they cannot attend meetings in person? Well, as I said earlier, you all know your community and the people that live there better than any one of us. If you know there are limitations on computer availability or internet for whatever reason, it should make a light go on that you need to explore other options. Many communities broadcast live meetings on a local cable television station. Maybe a local radio station would pick up the feed if there was an especially contentious topic on the agenda, for example. The only real advice I can give you, and again, this is not legal advice, is to do what you can. Work with your IT staff, work with your community members that express issues to accessing your information. And not just for your public meetings, it could be all your information. So you may really need to be creative in some of those cases, but again, do what you can. That's really the biggest thing. I will now respond to, we do have a couple of questions that have been posed during the seminar, and I'll get to those with the remaining time. We've got about 7 minutes left. So please continue to submit questions if you have them. I have a question. If public universities are offering online classes this fall, but some classes are still in person, would the public university be required to present the in-person classes online as well for those who cannot attend due to a disability that presents in-person class during COVID-19? Would these new type of COVID issues be covered with the ADA? Okay, long question, but so the primary crux of this question is you have public universities online and in person. What are the accessibility requirements? I would suggest that for all visual presentations that you do online, that you consider, because again, you do know all of the attendees and the students registered for the class, ask all your students in your class if they need accommodation. If they do, and they tell you what accommodation they need, work with your ADA coordinator or whomever is responsible to accommodate those students. Similarly, with your in-class instruction, you should also know your students and the needs based on those accommodation requests, which are typically through the university, not directly to the instructor. I think both ADA and IDEA, as well as the Rehabilitation Act, all have roles to play in this question. And again, it gets very complex with education, especially at a higher education level. I think there are probably as many or more physical barriers to the disabled at many universities than there are virtual or online. Next question is, will this slide presentation and audio be available after the webinar? It absolutely will. And you can watch for an email, and I'll discuss that on the next slide when we're done. And then someone is asking, I see raise hand, chat, and Q&A. So if you are responding to if you're using an iPad, I unfortunately am not using an iPad, so cannot tell you where the CC option is. Somebody asked that at the very, very beginning. I apologize for not getting that to you earlier. But we will be and have been recording this, and we will also provide the information when we're done. So I don't see any more questions. So, oh, I do have one more question. How are you captioning this meeting? Well, that is a good question, and I hope the captions have been helpful. One of our marketing staff has a written transcript I made for most of this presentation, and Zoom allows you to designate someone to enter those captions, and we designated Tiffany. So she's using my written transcript, again, that we will make available to all of you after this meeting. And she's copying and pasting the text into the caption window, which is then displayed for all of you to see. So if it sounds like I'm reading, I'm trying not to make it sound that way, but that's why it sounds that way. And we decided to do it this way since this is a pretty simple webinar without that direct interaction verbally with any of you. And since I'm the only one speaking, I can control what I say, hopefully. So during this part of the Q&A, Tiffany has had to manually enter those questions. So when I got into that last question about the university, hopefully she was able to keep up. But again, if not, it will be in our follow-up. So I don't see any other questions. So we will move on to our closing slide. So again, on behalf of DLZ, I would again like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend this webinar. We hope you found it informative and that any expectations you had coming in were met. And I do apologize if we weren't able to respond to your specific question or not adequately cover an issue that is directly related to your specific issue. If that's the case, please feel free to contact me directly via email. My address is on this screen. It's first initial and last name, so S. Metzer, M-E-T-Z-E-R, @dlz.com. And any emails I'll get, I'll do my best to assist you or at least try to point you in the right direction to get that assistance. So watch your email for a notice on how to get access to the information that was presented today. We also will be requesting approval for continuing education credits and notify everyone when that becomes available for you to get those if you need those. If you have any additional questions or want more information or need assistance meeting your accessibility obligations, please don't hesitate to contact DLZ or myself. Our website, www.dlz.com, will allow you to locate which office is closest to you, though we do work all over the country, both as a company and as staff. And we'll do what we can to assist you or, again, point you in the right direction. So if there are any other ADA topics you'd like us to consider for a future webinar, let us know. Again, this is something that we're exploring, and this is really the first large seminar and webinar we've done, so hopefully it's been a success. And we do wish all of you luck. And again, thanks for attending today. So if there's no other questions, I will now end the meeting, and I wish all of you well.